It is such an honor for me to introduce Jason as our speaker today. Jason is the Assistant Head of School for Spiritual, Religious, and Community Life at Mater Christi School in Burlington, Vermont. He grew up on the South Shore of Boston and is the beneficiary of Catholic education from first grade through his advanced degree in theology and pastoral ministry from St. Michael's College of Vermont. Jason has been honored and privileged to serve Catholic elementary, secondary, and higher education institutions for 21 years of his career. Jason and his wife have been Mercy Associates for over 2 decades, and they have 2 sons. One of them is a 3rd grader at Mater Christi School. Jason, we look forward to learning from you and with you, and thank you for sharing your insight with us this morning. And I will turn it over to you. Thanks, Jason.
Hey, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, Kim. Thanks to Sister Lisa and Sister Regina and all of Mesa for the invitation to be here with you today. I'm really honored and humbled to spend this time with you all this morning. And I know I just was saying, as I got onto this call, I just was running from a meeting to teaching 4th and 5th grade and then running over here for this meeting. So I know that the demands on our time are many, and my goal for today is to have this be time well spent. And as I reflect a little bit on the topic today of servant leadership, and specifically mercy-influenced servant leadership. So I thank you all for your time and your attention. I know how valuable your time is. When I was asked to offer this reflection, I was thinking a little bit of someone who's a real role model and a servant leader for me. He's a priest, he's a Monsignor in the diocese here of Burlington, Vermont. And he was telling a story recently. He's retired now, but he was telling a story that several years ago, he was celebrating Mass for the entire school, so a local Catholic school. And he said there was a kindergarten student who was sitting in the front pews who was really kind of staring at him during the homily and kind of taking him in and just really studying him. And the next day, the Monsignor was in the school lobby and this little boy walked through and kind of stopped in his tracks and was staring at Monsignor. And Monsignor said hello to the little boy, and the little boy said, "Hi, I saw you." And Monsignor LaValle said, yes, I saw you yesterday at Mass." And the little boy said, "Yes, I saw you when you were all dressed up pretending to be a Christian." And Monsignor LaValle, the wisdom out of the mouths of babes, but he reflected, he reflects on that a lot, and it certainly, keeps him humble, he said. And he was talking to me a little bit about how, in many ways in our lives that we can be all dressed up and, pretending to be Christians. And I share that story with you today because I'm all dressed up and pretending to be a school administrator sometimes. In a very, very challenging time to be a school administrator. I'll say a word about this later, but at a time when so many are leaving this profession, school administration, and also teaching in general, and we know the reasons for that in many ways, but it's a challenging time to be in this work, but it's such an important call that we all have, and to respond to that call. So again, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to try to share my screen now, and hopefully that will work. Can everyone see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So just a couple shots of Burlington, Vermont there, of our school. It is a beautiful day here. It's in about 80 degrees and sunny. So we are enjoying this September so far here in Vermont. I thought I'd just share a brief overview of the presentation today as we get started. I'd like to, in just a moment, start with prayer. And then as I move through the presentation, talking about a sense of vocation that we all have, servant leadership itself, what mercy, in my view, what mercy servant leadership is. And then moving through, I think, some of the mercy charism and how the Mercy charism plays out in school leadership, specifically reflecting on the virtues of humility, hospitality, empathy, listening, healing, stewardship, and vision. As we go through, especially some of those virtues, my goal is to share a little bit about them, but also just to pose some questions for all of us. And I have to say, as I prepared this presentation, as we all know as teachers, this was a wonderful opportunity for me to reflect myself on what this work asks of us and what Mercy is asking of us today, and what these virtues ask of us as well. So I'm grateful for that opportunity. And just as I go through them, share a little bit, my goal is to really pose some questions for all of us to consider. And I would say too, part of my goal is that some of today's presentation will be a little theological and philosophical, and I hope practical as well for each of us. So one of the things we're talking about this year in our school, each year we do a deep focus on one of the core values, one of the Mesa core values that we all share as Mercy schools. And so this year we're really focusing on inspired by faith. And this year in the opening remarks, we talked about in Catherine McCauley's life, how she was so often, and even the Sisters of Mercy, so often that we think of them as Catherine and the Sisters of Mercy as women of action and of the work of justice, and certainly they were. But we are also talking this year in our own school about Catherine as a woman of prayer and the Sisters of Mercy as a woman of prayer, that their prayer and their participating in the Eucharist nourished them and gave them the strength and courage to do that important work that they have done since their founding. And so this morning, I share this quote by Mother Catherine McCauley: "Always before he undertook anything, Jesus prepared himself for it by prayer, and by prayer he also concluded it." And I thought it wise as we begin our time together to follow her advice and to begin our time together with prayer. And I'd like to share as we start our time of prayer together, the servant song. So just invite you wherever we are throughout the region, just to pause for a minute and to take a deep breath and to recognize our loving and merciful God in our midst, calling us to prayer. Let me be your servant, let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant too. Be a pilgrims on a journey, be a travelers on the road. We are here to help each other walk the mile and I will hold the Christ light for you in the night time of your fear. I will hold my hand out to you, speak the peace you long to hear. I will weep when you are weeping. When you laugh, I laugh with you. I will share your joy and sorrow till we sing to God in heaven. We shall find such harmony. Born of all being known together, of Christ's love and agony. Pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant. And let us pray. Leadership is hard to define. Lord, let us be the ones to define it with justice. Leadership is like a handful of water. Lord, let us be the people to share it with those who thirst. Leadership is not about watching or correcting. Lord, let us remember it is about listening and connecting. Leadership is not about telling people what to do. Lord, let us find out what people want. Leadership is less about the love of power and more about the power of love. Lord, as we continue to undertake the role of leader, let us be affirmed by the servant leadership we witness in your Son, Jesus. Let us walk in the path he has set, and let those who will follow. Let our greatest passion be compassion, our greatest strength, love, our greatest victory, the reward of peace. In leading, let us never fail to follow. In loving, let us never fail. Amen. So I'd like to begin by talking about vocation, this vocation that we all have to school leadership in an extremely challenging time. We're emerging from a pandemic. We're seeing the many social, emotional impacts that that's having on our students and their families and in society as well. Our culture seems to be changing in so many ways, and our society, as we all know too well, is divided and polarized. People are in their camps, and there seems to be very little desire for dialogue. And so healthy, vibrant schools that care for the whole child and even for our families are more critical than ever. And schools, and I'm sure that you all see this as well, schools are becoming not only educational centers, but they're becoming parental educational centers, mental health centers, physical health centers, spiritual centers, and more. And somehow, in some way, we're called to be leaders at this time. And maybe some of us responded to this vocation, this call.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes. I'm good, Michelle. How are you? Yep, this is fine.
Hi, sorry. Maybe
We're
some.
okay. I
Okay.
muted her. We're okay.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay,
Sorry
thank-
about that.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, thank you. I wasn't sure. So maybe some of us came to this vocation like Isaiah in the image that we can see on our screens and said, you know, he saw the need and said, here I am, send me. Maybe some of us came to this particular call like Jonah and wanted to run from the call. But however we came to this call, I firmly believe that we are all called to this important work for a reason at this time, and that we're not left alone in the challenges that we have. Whenever the work of school leadership becomes challenging or exhausting or frustrating or difficult, I personally strive to remember that God has called upon me and my work and upon all of you in your own school communities to be of service to God's people to build up the community. And that God therefore has provided us with the charisms, with the gifts to build up the community. One of the questions that I often think about and reflect on in my own leadership at Mater Christi School here in Burlington is, what are my charisms and how am I using my specific gifts and charisms to bless and to build up the school community? You know, in scripture, charism is that Greek word used in the New Testament for favor or gratuitous gift. And these are these gifts that are special abilities that we all have provided by the Holy Spirit to support the community, to bring the community to a new place and to a new depth. And sometimes as leaders, we're called upon to have many different of these charisms. We can't have all of them, but we do have some of them. And we're all in the challenges we have provided with these gifts for our communities. Today, we're really focusing on servant leadership. And just when I think of servant leadership, I know what's been of influence to me in servant leadership. And first and foremost is the life, ministry, and example of Jesus. In his life and his ministry, the way that Jesus was with people, the way that he listened to people, the way that he broke cultural norms and reached out to people and brought healing and mercy and love to people's lives. Think of from Matthew's gospel, Jesus quote, "Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant." I've also been influenced in my own study on leadership by Robert K. Greenleaf, who really is the pioneer in modern servant leadership movements. And as you can see on your screens, he says here, the servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. I like this part that Robert K. Greenleaf says, the servant leader focuses primarily on the growth and well-being of people and the communities to which they belong. The servant leader shares power, puts the needs of others first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. And I think about that in terms of our work. So much of our work is by necessity, asks us to do that very thing, to share the power, to put the needs of others first, and to help people develop and perform as highly as possible. So that is, it is challenging work, but so critical to the work that we do as school administrators. And I think also about, in my previous job before coming back to Mater Christi, I was actually part of the founding team of a middle school. This was in the North Shore of Boston. St. John's Prep has been a high school since 1907 for all boys, grades 9 to 12. And in 2014, they launched a middle school. They opened up a middle school for grades 6, 7, and 8. And I was the campus minister and an administrator, the founding team of that middle school. And we talked a lot about servant leadership and what we wanted our young men to gain from their experience at St. John's Prep. And we had a very simple definition of servant leadership that we shared with the young men there, and that is positively influencing every situation we encounter for the benefit of others. And I found that young men found that to be very helpful, whether it was in the classroom or student council or on the field or at the rink, on a court, positively influencing every situation they encounter for the benefit of others. And so that's influenced my thinking on servant leadership as well. And then I think about Catherine McCauley. As Susan mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, I've been a Mercy Associate for over 20 years. And the Sisters of Mercy, I got to know them really through my wife, who went to Trinity College, which was a Mercy College, which has since closed right here in Burlington. And their witness and their example had a huge impact on me. Their goodness, all that they've done for the Burlington, Vermont community and beyond Their desire to really know people, to personally know people, to remember names, to remember details about people. They're just remarkable witnesses. And as I got to know Catherine and her story, I was really amazed and felt so called to Mercy and to Mercy Association. So Catherine and the Sisters of Mercy have had a large influence on my thoughts about servant leadership. And then finally, just the witness of good leaders, the good leaders that I've been privileged to know in my work and in my own life. My head of school, just a very quick example, and I certainly don't want to embarrass him, but it's such a privilege to work with someone who is a servant leader. I just saw him as I was coming to this presentation. He was carrying a keyboard downstairs and bringing it to the music teacher. Apparently hers wasn't working, so he got one from another room and ran across campus with a keyboard. And he wouldn't think anything of that, in the middle of all the things that he has to do. He is always doing something for the benefit of others, without a thought, without just is what needs to be done, and he does that. So I've really been around some wonderful guides and mentors in my own life as well. I also just wanted to share a little bit about, this book has had a large influence on me, really about the interior work of leadership. There's a wonderful book called Heroic Leadership by Chris Lowney, and he was a Jesuit. He was in Jesuit formation and training before he felt a vocational shift. He's in the business world, and now he teaches ethics to large multinational corporations. But he talks about heroic leadership, and the book is quite detailed, but these were 4 points that he mentions that I really appreciated about the interior work of leadership. And I personally reflect on these quite a lot. And they are: we're all leaders, and we're leading all the time, well or poorly. And he goes into detail of so obviously leadership is about the words that we say, but it's also, it's how we are in day-to-day moments of life. That leadership springs from within. It's about who we are as people as much as what we do. And that's that real interior work of leadership that for me is cultivated in a life of prayer and reflection and trying to seek out wisdom. That leadership is not an act, it is our life. It's a way of living. He talks a lot about how we don't have to be in formal leadership positions to have great influence over others. And I just also want to just share personally, one of the leaders in our school, he actually won. The yearbook was dedicated to him last year, was one of our custodians here at school. He's an immigrant, and he would never think of himself as a leader, but the way that he carries himself, the way that he interacts with people, his work ethic is just off the charts. He would do anything for anyone in the school. He's kind, he's caring, he's pleasant, and that's noticed. And the students wanted to honor him with the dedication, and he was very humbled by it. But such a wonderful example of leadership in the school, and that students noticed his example and wanted to honor him for that. And I think that is a real sign of his humility and the role. He would say, I take care of the building. That's how he would say, but he obviously had a much greater impact than that. And then finally, we never complete the task of becoming leaders. It's an ongoing process. And so the best leaders that I've ever known and been privileged to know in my life are lifelong learners. They respond to the challenges of the time, and they're always growing in their sense of leadership. So these for me have helped guide my own thinking about leadership and servant leadership. And then I think about, we're all called to leadership, and we're all given certain gifts to be leaders in our own school communities. But there's a special gift that we all have, I believe, and that we're all given by God to be mercy leaders. And mercy is a special gift, a special charism, and it's something that we're all called to do. And what does mercy look like? And there's so many ways to answer this, but for me, these are my thoughts in regards to what mercy calls us to do as leaders. The Hebrew word for mercy is chesed, which means faithfulness, loving kindness, and steadfast love. And it's often in Hebrew scriptures is the love that God showers upon us. But we're called to be filled with that love and then to spill that mercy, that chesed to others in our lives. Mercy in ancient Greek is ilios, which is derived from the ancient Greek word of oil, which I think is so interesting, the way that oil was used in the ancient world, as it was medicinal, it was comforting, it was soothing, it was something that was used in healing. And this is also a description of God's mercy. It's medicinal, it's healing, it's soothing, it's comforting. And that as mercy leaders, we're called to bring this mercy into our work as well. And then Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica defined mercy as the compassion in our hearts for another person's misery, a compassion which drives us to do what we can to help him or her. And I think Catherine Macaulay must have been influenced by that. And it was this sense of real compassion for another that wells up when we see another person suffering, another person in misery, that it just prompts us into action, that we want to do something to alleviate that suffering. And we see that in the life and ministry of Jesus. We see that in the life and ministry of Catherine Macaulay as well. And Catherine Macaulay says that mercy is the principal path pointed out by Jesus Christ to those who are desirous of following him. And for Catherine Macaulay, I believe my understanding of Catherine is that is the way to follow Jesus. That is the path to follow Jesus, is mercy. And I so appreciate this prayer of hers, this prayer that she wrote. "O compassionate Jesus, look on me today with tenderness and give me the grace to walk on the path of mercy, marked out for those who follow you. May all I do today reflect your merciful love. Amen." I try to pray that prayer every morning as I begin my work. My son is in third grade, and he comes in the morning with me. We come in together, and very soon the day begins. But I find it so important to begin my day with a word of prayer. Those words of prayer that Catherine shares, that path of mercy, because very quickly, as we all know in our days, the several different demands can come at us at once, and it can be overwhelming. But it's so important, for me, it's critical to start my day remembering this call to mercy as we follow in Catherine's footsteps. So I love this sculpture. I don't know if any of you have seen this before, but I so appreciate this sculpture. And it's from Australia. And the sculptor Peter Wegner completed this piece. And it captivated me when I looked at it, just Catherine in the warmth that you can see emanating from her in this sculpture, just her embrace of the child. And Peter Wegner, who's the sculptor, said he hoped the sculpture would show Catherine's kindness, empathy, and compassion towards the poor and disadvantaged. She draws the child closer in a comforting and gentle embrace, and instills a sense of trust, which is exchanged and shared. And you can see that in the child as well. This sense of the warm embrace of Catherine is also the warm embrace of God, and how we're all called to do that. At the dedication of this statue, the Archbishop said these words, and I thought of these words so much as I prepared the presentation. When he spoke of Catherine, he said, "Somehow in this woman, God walked the streets of Dublin and far beyond." And I really was captivated by that quote. And I thought, how can we as mercy educators allow God to walk in us as we walk through our classrooms and our halls and offices, wherever we serve? If people could ever feel that somehow in some way in my own service, in my own ministry, that God walked in me and accompanying them, that would be a vocation, a life of service well lived. Pose that question to all of us. I was so captivated by the Archbishop's words there about Catherine Macaulay. And then sharing a little bit of virtue ethics has been a big influence in my own life when I think about the practice of virtue and how the practice of virtue allows those virtues to grow in us. Aristotle famously said, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit." So in our own school at Mater Christi, each grade has its own virtue that they focus on. So we have our overall core focus, but then each grade has its own virtue that their teacher or teachers, depending on the grade, help them to reflect on in the year. And that guides their retreats and when they offer prayer to the whole school, they focus on that virtue. So for instance, the first grade is coming up soon, and their virtue is listen, which I'll be speaking about in a little bit. And so in the goal of that program for us is that each grade can practice a virtue and reflect on a virtue and practice, and that will help them to grow in that virtue. So when I think of the Mercy Charism as a Mercy associate and someone that's been part of Mercy for a long time, and you think about what is the Mercy Charism? What does it feel like when you engage with Mercy, when you know the Sisters of Mercy? What do you notice? What do we feel in this Mercy Charism? And I think about these virtues. Think about humility and hospitality, empathy, listening, healing, stewardship, and vision. And so my hope is to share a brief word about each of those virtues and ask us some questions as we go through. Well, the first is humility. And from my understanding of Catherine Macaulay, she had a great love for humility and often speaks of its merits and often speaks of the virtue of humility as being one of the foremost and foundational in the life of Mercy. In her familiar instructions, she speaks of humility as the mother of all virtues, which supplies for every deficiency before God. And of course, in Christianity, humility is the virtue where we recognize who we are before God, that we're entirely dependent on God, and that every gift in our lives is unmerited by us and a result of God's mercy. I love that the roots of the word humility are connected to the ground, that humility grounds us, humus, and also that humor is very connected to the word humility, that they have similar roots. On the importance of humor, which played a major role in Catherine's life, and which I think as school administrators, it's critical that we all have a healthy dose of humor in our work. Catherine Macaulay really taught that her sisters that growth happens day by day by the little decisions that we make each day. And she would say this from rising to dressing to eating, and she called the sisters to the perfection of the ordinary act. She pointed out that these little virtues help us to grow in large ways. And Catherine was a model of humility in her own life. In the early days when the House of Mercy opened on Bagot Street, she served at table. When guests unexpectedly came to Bagot Street, she was known to give up her own bed and sleep on the floor. And didn't think anything of it. It's what needed to be done. And it's also connected to a real sense of Irish hospitality, which we'll talk about in a minute. And she was very reluctant to assume titles. First of all, she was reluctant to become a religious in the first place, as I'm sure you know. But then secondly, in those days in Ireland, the head of a religious order of sisters was called Reverend Mother. And she didn't want to be called that. She preferred to be Mother Catherine. And then one novice early on speaks about how Catherine never referred to herself as the foundress of the community. So Catherine lived a life of great humility in all those ways, let alone in the way that she served the poor. So I think about in our own schools, how are we as leaders called to practice humility? And I think often one of my favorite quotes about humility is from C.S. Lewis, who said, "True humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less." And in so many ways, people are drawn to humility. I think of the leaders I've known in my own life who have just been humble women and men. People are drawn to humility. We know it when we see it, and it's something that's attractive, and it inspires other people to practice the virtue of humility as well. So the questions I think about for all of us: how can we be humble mercy leaders? Leaders who think of ourselves less and who know who we are before God, who can laugh at ourselves, who can ask for help, who practice humility and simplicity like Catherine, and who, in the words of the servant song that was the beginning of our prayer, will have the grace to let others be our servant too. Often talk about that there's such giving and receiving in leadership, in humility as well, that when we allow others to serve us as well, and sometimes we can have a distaste for that, or we can make us feel uncomfortable or awkward, but in many ways, when we allow others to help us and serve us, that's giving them a gift as well. And I think that's something that we may all be called to do. And finally, that laughing at ourselves, that importance of humor. And all throughout Catherine's writings, we can see that she had just a wonderful sense of humor about the foibles of human life, about the eccentricities of people, about herself as well. And I think that is such an important gift for all of us to have in our work in these challenging times. So next is hospitality, and I'll say the hospitality, the sisters, when I got to know the sisters so well, it was really their hospitality that drew me to them. And I recognized their hospitality right away, having spent some time in Ireland. When I was in college, I studied in Ireland and lived there for 4 months. I studied the peace process in Northern Ireland in 1999. It was right after the Good Friday Accords. And I lived with families during the study. I was based in Dublin, went to Belfast, went to Derry, and then lived in the rural West Coast for a while. And each place had the wonderful opportunity to live with Irish families for some time. And hospitality was something that just, no matter what family I was with during that time, I was so struck by the hospitality they showed. It's such a cultural virtue that certainly Catherine was influenced by, but she had her own, she cultivated her own sense of hospitality in a very Christian sense as well. Catherine was warm and kind. She brought people into her. She felt at home with herself, and others felt at home with her. Just even thinking about what she did, one of her major accomplishments in building the House of Mercy and then opening the doors to people who were in need and people who she didn't know. Think about that in terms of a sign of hospitality, to build a house. And certainly she lived there and ministered there, but it was really not for her. The house was for others and for others in need. That is just such an expression of hospitality that's so wonderful. And these words of hers, which are so famous, I love the image of the teacup there, which was actually brought by Catherine Macaulay from Coolock House to Bagot Street. But be sure to have a comfortable cup of tea for them when I am gone. These very famous words. She said these words as she was preparing for her own death. And she was concerned about the welfare of her sisters who would be experiencing grief. And her concern was for them. As she departed them, her concern was for them and for their welfare and for their well-being. She was a hospitable person to the very end. And I think about, in so many ways, here I see at our own school that so many families have joined us. We just had a Welcome Back Carnival this past week. We had our opening liturgy last week. And so many parents and families are feeling such joy at being part of our school community. And something that kept coming up in their words were, it feels like home. It feels like home here. In fact, we have a family whose mother of the two children is Jewish. She grew up though in Latin American country, and she grew up going to Catholic schools, and she herself is Jewish, and her children have been in the area public schools for some years, and for a variety of reasons they were looking for a change, and I saw her at the carnival the other night, and she said, "This is home." And she said, and she was very clear. She said, I'm Jewish. My children are Jewish and Christian, but this is home for me, and I'm so happy. And she said, we've been looking for home. And that quote just really struck me, because I think in so many ways, our families, our students, they're looking for a place to belong. They're looking for a place where they can be known and then valued and treasured for who they are. And that's a deep cultural need that we're seeing in our own community. I'm sure many of you are as well. This real need to feel welcomed, to feel at home in a place. And so I think about, for myself and for all of us, how do we create hospitable environments in our schools? How do we welcome new students and their families, faculty and staff? How do we help others to feel at ease and at home with us when we're talking with them? And in our schools as well. How in the busyness of our days, and we know they're very busy and taxing, how can we help those we serve feel that we see them, that we listen to them, and that we welcome them with warmth and care? And then I also think about, how can we show hospitality to the neighborhoods in which our schools are located and the broader community as well? How can we reflect mercy, hospitality to those we serve? The next charism and virtue I think about when I think about the mercy charism and the mercy way of life is empathy. Our head of school, I mentioned him a little while ago, Tim Loescher, so he and I had the privilege of teaching 4th and 5th grade religion classes this year. We did this last year as well. And we start our year talking about health of mind, body, and spirit. And we talk about in our classes, we try to practice both. So we sometimes do exercise, physical exercise in class, just to give them a physical mental break. We work, obviously in class, they're working on their minds and their reflection and growing as people. And we practice spiritual growth through reflection and prayer as well in class. But we were talking about, what does it look like to be spiritually healthy, physically healthy, mentally healthy? And of course, for students, it was more difficult to define what spiritual health looks like. They struggled a bit with that. But we concluded as a group, after some time thinking about that in many ways, spiritual healthy people are those that they're grounded and free enough to feel their emotions properly. So one of the students kind of said, when something or someone is sad, I can feel sad for them too. When someone's feeling joy and has a reason to celebrate, it's spiritually healthy to share in that joy with them too. So this was the wisdom of our 4th and 5th graders. And it really, we talked about it in a broad context. But I was thinking about the words of the servant song, which we started with when I think about empathy. I will weep when you are weeping. When you laugh, I'll laugh with you. I will share your joy and sorrow till we've seen the journey through. Will you let me be your servant? So this wonderful mercy, this sense of compassion, of suffering with other people when they're struggling, and the impact that has on them. Even last week, there was a boy in our school, 3rd grade boy, who lost his kitten. His kitten died, and it was a surprise for him. And I think it may have been his first experience with grief. And it was the kitten was young, and so he was really surprised by it. And I could see when his mom reached out to me, and I knew that he was upset. And I had him in my office for some moments, and we talked about it, and he was able to shed some tears. And I shared a prayer with the family that they could say on losing a pet. And I think that gesture in all the tasks. I had a school board meeting, I had many other things after that day, but as in my own reflection, I was thinking, that moment was a moment that when I look back at my days, it was one of my favorite moments of that day, to be able to share that empathy with him and to suffer with him in that moment. And I hope that certainly bears fruit in his own life, as he remembers, someone was with me in my grief, in my sadness. And Catherine Macaulay was so moved by, she had such empathy for others, but she witnessed that in her own father, in James Macaulay, who the way that not only did he provide the poor in the area of Dublin he lived with food and with articles of clothing that they needed, but she was often just really captivated by the way he did that with others. It wasn't just handouts, it was the way that he was with people, how he looked at them, how he spent time with them and listened to them, and how he got down at their level if they were low. That's something that Catherine witnessed in her own father, and then in her own ministry as well. The image that's on the smartboard on the right here is an image of the Sisters of Mercy providing food for the poor. And I was reading a little bit about, at this time, there were 4 laws in effect that the Anglo-Irish government had in effect. And what people noticed very quickly was they could get a bowl of soup from the government outreach. But when they came to get a bowl of soup or a piece of bread from the Sisters of Mercy, not only were they nourished by the food they received, but they were also nourished by the kindness that the sisters showed. It wasn't just handing food or soup out to others. It was the care that they felt from those sisters, and the impact that had on them, because they had other hungers as well. It wasn't just the hunger, of course, for food. It was the hunger for human kindness and decency, and to be treated with integrity. So I think about that. There's this quote, let me just share here. Sorry, one second. There's this quote from a reflection on the spirituality of Catherine Macaulay as rooted in the Beatitudes. And it talks about her sense of empathy. And she says, if our hearts are not moved, in vain shall we move the hearts of others. So she talks about the importance that if our hearts are not moved, in vain shall we move the hearts of others. So Catherine's spirituality was influenced by the suffering that she herself experienced in her own life. And really, the study of her life shows incredible suffering that she endured in many ways in her life and ministry. By the suffering of others around her, she didn't have to look far in her time to see suffering people outside of her doorstep. And by her own deep connection in her spiritual life and her prayer life with the agonizing Christ and Christ crucified. Catherine embraced suffering, and she didn't run from it. Nor did she seek to wear it as a badge, but her embrace of suffering led her to be a woman of deep compassion and empathy. And this embrace of suffering was also infused with the hope of the resurrection. So all of us as school administrators, we engage with so many people in our communities, and sometimes we're privy to information in the behind the scene realities of people's lives. And it can be overwhelming, but this authentic empathy is so critical in our roles. So the questions I ask myself are, in our roles, how do we empathize or suffer with those we serve? How do we share in their joys and their sorrows? How do we allow our hearts to be moved, especially when we're busy? And to what level do we embrace suffering, the cross of Christ? And how can we experience those we serve? How can we experience their suffering as well and seek to heal it in our own way? The next virtue is listening. And I'm very influenced in my own life by Benedictine spirituality as well. And Saint Benedict, the father of Western monasticism, has said right at the beginning of the rule, the Benedictine rule says, listen. It's really, the word is obsculta in Latin. It's listen carefully. by inclining the ear of your heart. Listen with the ear of your heart is often what's said. So listen certainly with our ears, but listen with our hearts as well. It's such a call of mercy. And then the Lutheran theologian Paul Tillich said, the first duty of love is to listen. That wisdom to listen is so vital today in a culture where there's constant noise around us. There and so many demands on our ears in so many ways, in our attention. And there's no doubt in my mind that Catherine Macaulay was a good listener. First of all, she was a contemplative in action. So she was a woman of prayer. She listened for God's providence and God's guidance and wisdom. But she was also influenced by her culture. She was well brought up and she was polite and warm and compassionate. People felt with Catherine that they were heard and that she understood who they were. And she demonstrated a real sense of listening love. And she also showed personal knowledge of people, her sisters who were in the community and those she served. She really took the time to listen to who they were as people, not just with their ears, but with the ear of her heart as well. I just want to read for you when you think about listening. This was just written, and I found this in my research and preparation for the talk. And I just want to share this a little because I thought it was so compelling. It's by Sister Patricia McCarthy from Rhode Island. And she wrote a beautiful reflection about listening. And it has to do with tea, which I thought was so interesting, tea in Ireland. And it has to do with Catherine's hope that her sisters would have a comfortable cup of tea after she died. And she said, drinking tea in Ireland is a process that takes time. The experience is more about the slowing down and the spending the time with another than the actual drink. It's not always possible in the midst of life's demands to stop and make the tea, but it is always possible to stop, to take that moment, to let that moment come into your consciousness. Whether it be a good moment or a challenging one, a push of the pause button helps. Knee-jerk reactions on our streets, in our homes, or at school board meetings are creating a culture of total impatience, of vulgar and rude accusations, of rush to judgment. It seems impossible to agree, to disagree. The art of listening is a lost one. Those with opposing opinions from us have become the untrustworthy others. They're threatened and vilified. We seem to be creating a world of us and them. The only world which will be worth living is in the world of just we. Sitting and having a cup of Irish tea with someone who is lonely or sad or stressed is an act of mercy. It is a Christian witness. Having a conversation with someone with whom you disagree is a powerful statement about the ability of human beings to live with differences and graciousness. That can be a witness to a life lived in charity and grace. And so the article goes on. It's just a beautiful, I think, and compelling argument about the importance of listening, a call to listen. And she talks about in the stress of our days, and she is specifically really, because she's an educator herself, is talking to school administrators, and so many things can come our way. And sometimes we're on a mission and we can get stopped many times in the hall, or a phone call can stop us, but taking that pause to listen and the importance of that she's reminding us that there is a contemplative role or a contemplative aspect to our roles. So the questions I think about with listening: how do we take time to listen to God's voice in our own lives? Do we listen to others with the ear of our heart? Can we sit down with people who are struggling and listen to them, who disagree with us even? And can we pause before speaking or acting and allow the Holy Spirit to rest in our spirit and act out of that spirit? Coming close to the end, just a few more of these. I'm just doing a time check. Healing is something that, of course, our vocation is, in a sense, where we don't share in the healing ministry that many sisters do in the medical field, but in our own roles, we are called to healing. Share a quote with you that you can see on the smartboard. It's from a wonderful book that I so enjoy and appreciate called Introducing the Practice of Ministry. And Kathleen Helen says, the healing stories of Jesus in the Gospels point to God's presence as healer, redeemer, consoler, and restorer of life. God intends that sickness, suffering, and death will not be the final word or reality for each human person, but that healing from all misery will come about in the final days. In this sense, the healings are a sign, a glimpse of the eschaton breaking in the present moment. So the Sisters of Mercy have a tradition of healing that goes all the way back to Catherine McAuley, who really studied, for her day, the modern techniques of healing when she cared for the Callahans, who she was a caretaker of. And then later, as the demands of the time for the Sisters of Mercy, she responded to the needs of the community in Ireland and beyond, when there was a need for compassionate, caring medical care. And so it's always been a part of the Mercy tradition. And it was countercultural, just like many, many things that Catherine did. It was a personal care, a tender care for the sick. And that was completely different than how medical care was done in Ireland at the time. And as educators, we don't, as I mentioned, we don't offer healthcare except for our nurses, our school nurses, but we are called to healing ministry. And pastoral care traditionally has included 4 aspects. There's a healing aspect to pastoral care, which is about helping people to be whole. There's the guiding, there's the sustaining aspect, which is helping people who experience loss. And that loss could be through grief and loss of the death of a loved one, or a major change in people's lives, transitions that people go through. So there's a healing and a sustaining aspect. There's a guiding aspect as well, where we help people in their moral discernment. Who should I be? How should I live? And then finally, a reconciling aspect of healing, where we are called to help others in our communities to experience the healing of forgiveness. In our roles, we're called to offer this care as school administrators, as leaders, to offer this kind of healing care. And that could be with students, it could be among our faculty, it could be the school board, all the constituents that we have. How are we healers? So the questions I think about, how are we healers? Where do I need healing in my own life? How do we stand close to people in need of healing? And how do we practice the healing, sustaining, guiding, and reconciling work? The images on the smartboard right now are of the Mercy International Center. This is the front doors of Bagot Street, which I have had the pleasure of visiting on a couple occasions. And when I think about stewardship, I appreciate this quote here by Pope Francis. In the end, everything has been entrusted to our protection, and all of us are responsible for it. Be protectors of God's gifts. When Catherine McAuley had her inheritance, she inherited the equivalent of $5 million today. And I think about what she did with that. And she almost spent that entire fortune that she inherited on building this house of mercy, the house of mercy. It was the home itself was an expensive home. And also the area where she built the home was very intentional. And also therefore very expensive. This area of Bagot Street at the time of Catherine was in an upscale, fashionable area of Dublin. And it was kind of a place that bordered where the poor lived and where the wealthy lived. And she chose this location, which is her genius, very intentionally, so that the wealthy could not turn away from the suffering of the poor. And so she took this treasure that she received, and it's just a stunning story of her brilliance and her dedication, and built this house with it. But it cost her just about the entire fortune that she inherited to build this house. And once it was built, she had very little left. And from there on, she turned everything over to God, which was such an act of incredible trust. And so when I think about stewardship, I think Catherine's modeling of it is quite incredible. It's responsible planning and management of resources, but it's also a deep sense of trust. And there's so much that I could say about this, but as school leaders, we're all asked to be protectors of the Mercy tradition, of the history and legacy of our school communities, and protect those in a time that is where we see so much change. We are all standing on the shoulders of giants. And how do we protect the legacy of our school? How do we ensure that we are planning responsibly and ensuring that our schools live on to serve our students for generations to come? And so the questions I think about in our call to be stewards is, how do we practice stewardship using our school's resources with responsibility, respect, a passion for our mission, and trust in God? How do we preserve, uphold, and celebrate the legacy of our schools and our Catholic and Mercy traditions? And finally, the last virtue to reflect on that I think so often about when I think about Catherine is her sense of vision. She was a visionary. She was countercultural. And she dreamed of a new reality for the poor, for the sick, for the uneducated, for discipleship in her time, for religious life. It's amazing to look at her life and think about just, it's not that she abandoned tradition, but she was someone who always thought about possibilities and new ways of doing things. It's just it's remarkable quality of Catherine Macaulay. And she faced opposition. The leaders who have such vision, I think about leaders in my own life, leaders who have this kind of vision often face opposition from others because it's new. And she had a tremendous amount of opposition, but she also had allies in her life. She was a person who was in touch and in tune with the Spirit of God in her own life. And despite all the challenges that she faced, she found success in her work, in her mission. People were drawn to Catherine Macaulay and her vision. Her vision drew people towards her because they hadn't seen anyone like her before. They hadn't seen someone who thought the way that she did. She was exciting. The way that she looked at life and what she wanted to do. She had big dreams, and she had this vision that was so compelling, and people were drawn to her. We are the beneficiaries of her vision. If not for Catherine, the world would lack, think about what the world would lack: thousands of schools, hospitals, community outreach programs today, hundreds of thousands of people who are employed through Mercy institutions today, all these years later, wouldn't have meaningful work. Because Catherine persevered in the face of adversity, countless people benefit today, including our school communities. We live in very difficult and challenging times. It seems like things are changing so fast, and we hear that from a lot of our families. As Mercy educators, we are facing challenges in our society, in our communities, and with all those in our communities. Mercy is needed so desperately. Christ is calling us to be mercy, and Catherine is praying for us each day, I'm sure of it, as we serve our school communities. So the questions about vision that I reflect on: how can we cultivate a visionary spirit? How can we read the signs of the times and help our students grow in mercy? How can we be countercultural visionaries in our schools, and like Catherine, draw people to our missions and the works of mercy today? And finally, a simple question: how can we make Catherine proud in our work? And I'd like to close. Thank you all so much for your attention and trying to keep this within time, because I know how busy you are. But I'd like to just close with the words of the servant song and let you know that I hold you all in my prayers, trusting that this year will hold many blessings for you. I'll close with these words: we are pilgrims on the journey. We are travelers on the road. We are here to help each other, walk the mile, and bear the load. Thanks to each of you, and God bless.
Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much. You gave us so many things to reflect upon, especially I'm so glad that we have you speaking to us at the beginning of the school year, because there are so many questions. I sat and I just kept writing questions that I hope that I can hold in my heart. And I just want to share two of them. How can we allow God to walk in us as we walk through our classrooms and hallways? I just thought that that was so beautiful. And how do we listen to others with the ear of our heart? Love that. And how can we make Catherine proud? So thank you for sharing your insight and all that you do. And I hope for everyone that this gives us a great platform and a great foundation to begin our school year with lots of Catherine thoughts for the next 9 to 10 months. Jason, thank you. And thank you all for taking this morning to be with us. We hope it's a great rest of the day.
It's
Thanks,
my honor,
Jason.
my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason.